All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started with opening remarks. Good evening and welcome to the San Diego Public Library, or who I like to call the Palace of the People. Thank you for being us with this evening. It's a great celebration of the newest exhibition up on the 9th floor with the visual arts program, which is James Hubbell Architecture of Jubilation, which we are happy to unveil here in March, which will be on view through August 4th of this year. And it's also taking place at 3 other library locations, including Scripps Miramar Ranch with the Mountain Home and Studios story. We also have Mission Valley with the Pacific Rim Project, and then we have Otay Mesa-Nestor with Lado y Lado. So if you are up for traveling around the county and going to our other locations to see the James Hubbell Architecture of Jubilation, please do so. And if you'd like to learn more about the visual arts program and what we do, please check out mysdpl.org/visual arts. And you can get a sense of what exhibitions we have currently at all 18 of our branch locations, including what's coming up later in the fall of this year in our main fine arts gallery as well. So we've already went through some of the housekeeping reminders, but welcome to this talk tonight for all of our audience out in the internet, tuning in via YouTube. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight, Dave Hampton. He's a San Diego native engaged in the study of California's post-war visual art and architectural communities. He has worked with many artists and object makers who were active in the region in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with a particular focus on modernism and San Diego artists and craftspeople. Dave has curated many exhibitions, including print culture here at the San Diego Public Library, related to generally the mid-century design community topics, and is author of the San Diego's Craft Revolution. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dave Hampton.
I think she almost said San Diego naked there, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I heard. Yeah, here it goes. So the perspective that I want to share with you tonight is well suited for Earth Day and Jim's work in general, because it's going to be a little bit organic, a little bit rambling, but so I need you to bear with me. It's not exactly a straightforward linear process, but it was really inspired by the exhibition recently out in Santa Isabel, and as a kind of in response to this wonderful book. If you don't know about this book, you can come up and look at it afterwards. It's called Seeking Beauty, Jim's Gift, about James Hubbell by Angie Brenner and Sarah Jamieson. And it's really a wonderful book that especially taught me a lot about Jim's youngest years. That's really, I think, where the emphasis of this research is. And so I just wanted to share 1 or 2 facts before starting with the images and that impressed me. Jim moved around a great deal in his youth. His mother, who was his primary custodian, guardian, whom he lived with, had several marriages and several divorces. Jim, by the time he finished high school, had been in 13 different schools. And yet he was dedicated to drawing and sketching and observing the world, especially nature and horses, at a super early age, and carried a sketchbook with him relentlessly. Another, I didn't put this in the title here, but the time period that we're talking about, it's a little bit complicated. People use this word mid-century and mid-century modern. And that's now become extraordinarily broad. It means different things to different people. But for one aspect of that time period, I want to mention something that connects Jim's experiences and the greater American cultural awakening or circumstance of the late 1940s. And so Jim finished high school at a prep school in Connecticut, the Choate School, in 1950. And at that time, by the time he finished high school, he had already hitchhiked back and forth across the country no less than 3 times. And at that same point in time, in 1950, Jack Kerouac was trying to finish his final draft of On the Road. And so, I mean, this is really interesting to me because Jim's movement back and forth, he preferred to hitchhike. He preferred to meet people and interact with them and sort of risk not being on time. And his mother would send him a letter and saying, please, can I send you some money so you can take a train or a plane? And Jim preferred to travel this way. He traveled this way all around Europe, and it shows to me an incredible a sense, you know, a glimpse of his character, his confidence in the world, his lust for travel and observing the world around him and the people around him, his interest in humanity, which is also, and a kind of a restless spirit. And so, now to the beginning of these images. I'm jumping a little bit from that background. Jim does settle with his mother here in Rancho Santa Fe, even though he's going off to finish school or to go to an art school there or to go into the military service. His home base from, I don't know exactly when, but at some point in the late 40s or early 50s is Rancho Santa Fe. So another thing I want you to consider is wipe out everything that you know about Jim Hubbell and Julian and Hubbell Hill and Ilan-Lael. Wipe all that away. That doesn't exist. The years I'm going to talk about are concentrated, but I'm going to jump a little around outside of that core time period. So this image is from, it's a catalog, it's an exhibition catalog photograph from the famous series of exhibitions at Pasadena Art Museum called California Design. Now, that show, which happened every other year throughout the 60s and into the 70s, did more to group together important San Diego artists because it was drawing from all over the state, than any other exhibition I can think of. It continued, it grew and grew and grew, and this was from one of the very first catalogs. And there was a woman behind this, especially the growth of the series and the decision to put out hardback, lushly photographed books and catalogs and show the work to people that way and preserve it for history that way. Her name was Eudora Moore. And to take these photographs, that image of the man carrying a chair out into the sand dunes or into the desert is what they would do to get these incredible shots. And this is a time, the first, that catalog shot being from about 1962 or 1963. This is also a time when there is a pretty well-developed trend of craftspeople and artists working in a modern idiom that is not replicating antique practices, but doing something new, specifically working with architecture and building and so forth. And so there's an image here which is from a big group, the American Craftsmen's Council is what it was called at the time, and the Southwestern region, and there's a whole section in this big book about craftsmen and architecture. In San Diego, by the early 60s, this was really flourishing, but the important thing for me is that Jim was there doing this kind of work with building and architecture prior to this explosion, if you want to call it that. Some of the other people here that were practicing and really making this trend happen and become important were Jackson and Ella Marie Woolley, that you can see at the top with their installation in the Civic Center, and below them Toza and Ruth Radakovich, a terrifically talented couple that moved here in about 1969. I need to move more quickly. You might recognize these images from Balboa Park, the West Wing extension of the San Diego Museum of Art, the columns and the fascia and the gates designed by a man named Malcolm Leland. These images are of the Woolleys, large-scale murals, so Ella Marie and Jackson Woolley. They, after James Hubbell, were among the earliest people to practice this kind of working in a particular medium, working in a modern way, and then finding ways to apply it at larger and larger scale. We actually just drove past this on the way here. It's now a Paul Mitchell Hair School just across the way downtown, but it used to be the Union Bank, and there's a great big sand casting by a man from Solana Beach named Ira Spector. Here's a department store up in Orange County with a suspended sculpture by a well-known La Jolla architect named Russell Forrester. You may know that name. And then Rhoda Lopez, who came to the area in 1959. So she's not really at the beginning of this trend towards working with architecture, but she comes here to teach at the school, at the Art Center in La Jolla. She's making smaller tabletop scaled ceramics in a traditional manner, and then she starts making larger and larger scaled things, like the big urn you see there, the big unglazed stoneware urn, which is really large and heavy, incredible for one person to throw. And then gradually, because she knew James Hubbell and because she was seeing this trend developing all around her, she makes larger and larger works out of clay, this being a great big fountain wall that's currently, you can go and see it. It's at the All Souls Church in Point Loma, where Jim did those huge windows. And this is installed there, even though it was not built for that site. Another person that I want to mention quickly was a guy named Stan Bitters, who was hugely important to this idea of an artist craftsman working within architecture, working for that kind of application, doing special commissions for large-scale buildings. He was here he was from Fresno, and he's mostly associated with Fresno, but he was here in San Diego during the late 1950s. His name is Stan Bitters. The image there is from a big fountain up at the Fresno Mall, which at one point was a large open-air pedestrian mall in the middle of downtown Fresno that had incredible work by incredible California and national artists. So I just wanted to give you a feel for what happens in terms of architecturally scaled work, which is what we really associate with a lot of what Jim put out, is work that transcends, that incorporates, that is architecture, that you can live in, or that's for architecture. It's something very unique, and it's something that I can safely say that Jim was the backbone of this whole trend in San Diego, that he was really the first that I know of to do that kind of work in a modern idiom. Here's another example of that kind of thing. These photographs from that same California design series, they're a pair of enamel doors, brightly colorful, luminescent enamel on steel doors made by a La Jolla artist named Kay Whitcomb. And I mentioned Toza and Ruth Radakovich. They came to Encinitas in about 1959. They met Jim. They became close friends with Jim. And they had been jewelers, terrific sculptors, incredible life stories with many of these people. I'm just throwing names at you, but they're hugely important to our San Diego mid-century arts and architecture culture. And when they met Jim and when they saw what was happening in general and in San Diego with people doing larger scale work and things for the house and things for the garden, they started to do that same kind of thing. And in fact, one of the stories that I heard was that Jim helped show them how to blacksmith and forge iron. And so there's a gate there. That's a garden gate in the larger image in the center. There are hinges to one side, and it's all hand-forged steel. And so there was a lot of back and forth. What you also see are a number of handles for doors. Those are cast bronze door handles, all with a highly organic kind of shape, in many ways reminiscent of the kinds of shapes that Jim would do at that time. Close friends and a lot of back and forth in the things they made and in the ways that they worked. They exchanged tools, they exchanged techniques, they exchanged good bon ami. And then, okay, now we're switching gears again. This is Rancho Santa Fe. This is the home of Jim's mother in Rancho Santa Fe, and the photo was taken in 1956. In Keith's talk, which comes next month, Keith York will be speaking to you if you come. I have a feeling he may take up some images with this very same sculpture. But I want to mention it now because of its sighting. You see the little dog on the stump there? But this is where Jim really lived at that time. This is prior to anything out in Santa Isabel and Julian. Jim lived here. He built a studio here. He had a casting operation here, and he did a terrific amount of work here, even though he was still bouncing around the country and off to be in the military and the army and off to travel for 7 months in Europe. He did an incredible amount of work here. And Jim's mother was the proprietor of a clothing boutique called Flair in Del Mar, and also became the owner of a place called, actually it started with a different name. I think it was called El Ranchito, but she named it the Wishing Well Hotel in Rancho Santa Fe. This is an ad drawn by her son Jim for both those businesses from 1957. Here's another ad, again, mentioning both her businesses with obviously Jim's light touch in those wonderful figures illustrating the ad. And so what you'll see is that at the time, Jim, in the papers, I'm going to show you lots of printed matter, things that you might not expect, things that aren't flashy, sexy art photos or houses that look really cool. I approach this from a kind of a unusual archival sort of approach. And I also want to thank Laurel Costa a lot for help with, because the archives out there is terrific. She's terrific. Marianne's terrific. These are some photos and images that Laurel scanned for me. There's an original envelope for the El Ranchito Hotel before it was renamed, and then a postcard showing the exterior and the pool, and then a black and white part of an ad. And this ad mentions amusing murals by the owner's son, a county artist of acknowledged talent, as a parenthetical statement. So these are some images from a San Diego and Point magazine in about 1959. And again, the emphasis is on Jim and his residence in Rancho Santa Fe. Jim, one of the things that fascinates me about exhibition catalogs and lists of artists and things like this is it's a community. And what you see are the names side by side. You see the people that are together in an exhibition or listed here. And this is a whole bunch of craftsmen, some of them really significant to San Diego at that time. John Dirks, Jack Boyd, Martha Longnecker, founder of Mingay International Museum, Margaret Price, Barney Reed. There's James Hubbell, and Jim Sundell and the Woolies, of course, and all that kind of thing. And then here's another snippet of just an editorial piece talking about an enamel there by Ella Marie Woolley and showing an polyester resin window by Jim Hubbell. And it's shown in black and white, but I'm going to show you something that helps you understand it better. What I want you to see is that there's all kinds of bits of glass, maybe even marble, a kind of a mosaic, but it's all set into a polyester resin sheet. So it's not stained glass, which is what lots of us are going to associate with Jim and his work. He was doing some stained glass, but he really was captured by this new kind of material, which wasn't available for people to work with until this point in time. There were other artists at the same time trying to figure out, how do we work with polyester resin and chemical adhesion techniques. Here's a really lousy photo, I apologize, but it shows you the surface of something very similar. So you look back and you can see that's wire set into the polyester resin, the flower pattern kind of in the center, and you can see here the wire flower pattern set into, and this is a material that at that time they didn't know how to stabilize it, how to make it stay one color. So this is aged over many, many, many years. This was taken at Janet Richards' house, and the frame around it is original. It was part, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I can't not mention it because it was so important. It was part of the interior redesign of that Wishing Well Hotel. So this is the hotel Jim's mother, Julia Larea, owns. And with Bruce Richards, in about 1960-61, Jim and Bruce redo the interior. And you can see in the black and white image a kind of a very Frank Lloyd Wright-esque fireplace, which is one of Bruce Richards' standard. But the really important thing that I want you to notice are every one of these shapes is one of those polyester resin panels with colorful glass and broken up stones and so forth. And then at the right is a skylight, the same kind of thing, but stuck into the polyester resin sheet while it's still wet, stickable, are these great big turned sort of finials that Jim was doing. So those are lathe turned and might have been used for chairs or balustrades, staircases. Anyways, the color that is actually happening in those spaces is something a little closer to this. So every one of those panels, and Keith will in his talk, I think, describe that whole process. I'm not going to stick with the architecture stuff too much, but I did want to show you these. The panel here on the left is an early standalone composition showing Jim's kind of mosaic technique. There's all kinds of material in there, colored glass, and there might even be tints and dyes, and it's a kind of a fairly classical still life. There's a musical instrument like a lute or something, and it's just really, really beautiful. It's also from about 1955, 1956, so it's coming out of his studio in Rancho Santa Fe. And then much later, really, several years later, that's the shower with the polyester resin panel illuminated from the light outside, which is off of their first house at Ilan-Lael. And so again, showing the kind of composition, the use of that material, because Jim really did an awful lot of work that way, and it was clearly something that he thought he could adapt well to architectural uses, and something that he really put a lot of time into. On the left, on the other wall, you can see the shower head, if you look carefully, is an incredible mosaic on the wall that looks a bit more like what we've come to expect of Jim's work, but it's an early example. So one thing we haven't really talked about, talking about panels and windows, but Jim begins doing doors. And the first doors that, as I understand it at this point in time, the very first doors that he did were for the Wishing Well Hotel project, for his mom's property, working with Bruce Richards, and those are the first doors, according to what he said. The first doors were there at the Wishing Well Hotel. Note the organic approach to carving rather than any number of ways that you could go. You could approach decorating a wooden door. Very organic, much like his drawings and the work we associate with him. Also an inlay. There are rocks and colorful objects placed into the wood. And this idea of doors is one of the key areas that this idea of an artist working with a building or with architecture flourishes in San Diego. I would like to see a show just of doors that were done throughout this time period, because it would blow your mind. I mean, there are those enamel doors, the bright orange ones that we looked at earlier. So this is much, much later, but on the left is a door and a doorway, a door enclosure for a property that Keith got to handle not too long ago, the Weinberg House in Ramona. And you can see all around it are clay pieces made by Rhoda Lopez, the woman we talked about earlier. She wound up eventually doing lots of work with Bruce Richards. And this is a late example, but it shows you the kind of, to me, the fulfillment of the possibility of what they could do. The budget was great at this project. They got to do a lot of incredible work, and you can see Jim's design with metal incorporated with the door. And then on the right is Jim's friend, Toza Radakovich, the newly arrived sculptor who comes to Encinitas and is inspired by Jim, directly inspired by Jim, to make doors. He had never made doors before. He had never made stuff for the garden before. Jim is really rubbing off, and his influence is rubbing off. And so that's a door by Toza Radakovich, where it has incredible heavy forged iron, as well as a colored blown glass globe, where the old-fashioned idea of the little window that you peep through to look at something, well, you can't actually see through that, but there's beautiful light that comes through it. And delicate forged cage around it. And then Toza takes this idea that he gets from Jim to a new level as time goes by. A bit later in the 1960s, he learns about what people are doing to make surfboards, and that just like that new material with the polyester resin, there are people working with polyester foam and glassing materials and fiberglass and the resin that goes on top of the foam to make a smooth surface. And so he enlists a young friend that he's met in the community here who works with surfboards. His name is Carl Ekstrom, and together Toza carves out the shapes that he wants in a thick surfboard foam blank, if you want to call it that. And then Carl Ekstrom carefully, painstakingly layers on the surfacing material and makes it super smooth and beautiful, like he would one of his best surfboards. And the pair of doors on the right, photographed for that California design series that I've been talking about, are what comes out of Jim's rubbing off on another artist here in San Diego, who then gets inspired by new materials that surfboard makers are making. So, I mean, to me, this is a dizzyingly cool thing that's happening. And now we're going to go a totally different direction. Forget all that. So I'm going to talk to you now about some of the organizations that Jim first became involved with as he really takes his first steps as an exhibiting artist in San Diego. So Jim comes back after travel and after being at the Whitney School for a year or so, and he comes back, and then he is drafted and he goes to serve in Korea. And he returns from Korea, and this is an exhibition catalog from the Del Mar Fair, what we now call the Del Mar Fair. Then it was the Southern California Exposition at Del Mar, which I think it technically still is. So Jim has no less than 4 pieces in this 1954 Del Mar Fair show, And it's the first big group exhibition that I know of where Jim's work is included. And so he has a piece, several pieces refer to Korea. They were pieces, studies and sketches and watercolors that he did in Korea. The Honey Wagon, a Korean village, and so forth. And then at that time, you know, this is 1954, right? And San Diego, forgive me, conservative as hell. I mean, really conservative. This is the 50s. This is McCarthy time. And so the ideas of modern art and conservative art were segmented. What's the word? Can't think of the right word. Anyway, so there's a modern show. So Jim has one piece in the modern show that instead of being a specific reference to a subject, in a study of something, it's just soft color and lines. And I really hope we could maybe find that or a reference to that someday. So 1954 is the first big group show that Jim's in at the fair. Now, that exhibition every year at the fair gets better and better, gets cooler and cooler, gets more and more advanced. And this, from 1957, I want to just mention a couple of facts about this year, because in this year, you have a whole array of really significant folks involved. You might have heard the name John Baldessari. He's a young student still at San Diego State, and he's assisting on the installation and design of this particular show. Stan Bitters, the artist I mentioned earlier that did incredible large-scale environmental ceramics, he's doing the same kind of thing. And Ilse Ruocco is involved. Martha Longnecker provides the garden pottery, and so forth. So you get some really powerful San Diego people trying to be really progressive in that show. The next year, oh, and that's actually, these are images from that year, 57. The concrete blocks with the tree in the center are provided by Roscoe E. Hazard, you know, the big Hazard cement people. Architectural pottery, lanterns standing up on those posts. And then the next year is 1958. Jim is featured this year because he's been away at school, and then he's gone off to travel in Europe for like 7 months. And so he's there in 54, and then he's out for a couple of years, and in 58 he's back. And this year you have another stellar group of people putting on this show. And Jim is in a couple of different parts. So there's a big show of Southwestern craftspeople, and Jim is featured in that. And the kind of work that he does is called architectural accessories. And then he's also featured in the more conventional painting and drawing section. So that's the fair, and the fair was really important at that time. And then another organization was the San Diego Art Guild. There's been a lot of research and rumors of a book that's going to come out about the much lauded San Diego Art Guild. But to get into the guild, you have to participate, and this is another thing that I'm really like and will be exceedingly dull for most of you, but there's a list of the different shows that you could participate in order to qualify to get into the San Diego Art Guild. The San Diego Art Guild is associated with the museum in Balboa Park, the Museum of Art, right? It is the premier exhibition place in San Diego, and its artist guild grows out of its roots where there are people that wanted to contribute money, and they form a society called the Friends of Art, and that's how we got that building in Balboa Park. But there's also a group of working artists that want to be involved. And so there's a sort of lay group of artist encouragers, and there's a group of artists. And the Art Guild comes out of that group of artists that are supporting the San Diego Museum of Art. And so you had to participate in things like a show at the Allied Craftsmen's Annual, or a show at the Redondo Beach Annual, or Long Beach at their museums, or Grossmont College or San Diego State College, or accredited galleries, but you had to go through a process to get into these groups. They had regular exhibitions twice a year. Jim, one of the earliest mentions that I find about Jim exhibiting in that group was from 1957. He won an award for a wood sculpture called Live Oak, and it was awarded the Sculpture Prize in 1957. He also did some outdoor garden sculpture that won a prize in 1957 in a different show. So now he's starting to get out there more. He's come back from a lot of traveling. And here's a later one. This is the Art Guild again. And there are people in these shows that were the cream of the crop at that time. Painters like Ethel Green and Guy Williams, and a lot of different interesting people. Lynn Feynman, the photographer, Sarah Roberts, a terrific painter, and all these people got to know each other. It's a fairly small community, really, and in a way, there's a lot happening, and Jim is now moving into the middle of it. So in this catalog from 1959, Jim has 3 different pieces in 3 different media. He's got a sculpture in iron, forged iron, called a dowser. He's got a more conventional watercolor called The Way of the Jacaranda. And he's got an untitled ceramic pot. And here's a pot from around that time. So this is Jim's idea of a ceramic pot. So unglazed terracotta, it's cylindrical. The interior is glazed, so you could put flowers on it, or put water in it, in theory. But you could also turn it upside down, and it's a terrific clay sculpture. So the Art Guild is active and stimulating a lot of different activity, and every year there's several artists from the Guild and maybe the Allied Craftsmen too, and they get to show in things like Benbow's department store. And Jim is in this particular listing, which is I think from 1958 or 59, at Benbow's annual Accent on Art. And you see him along with all kind of other terrific artists. Again, Ethel Green, Fred Hawley, Martha Longnecker's in this show, and there's James Hubbell right at the top. So moving right along, another really key hub for contemporary art activity is now our Museum of Contemporary Art San Diego. Long ago looked like that, the black and white image in La Jolla. That's the old Sherwood Hall, which no longer exists, which kind of pains me. But Jim got a lot of traction at that institution. The people there were really committed to contemporary art, abstract expressionism in painting. The image that you see, the man who is the director of the museum is off at the side in the tie with his arms folded. His name is Don Brewer. He was himself an abstract painter and really wanted to cultivate this sense of new, younger talent. So dead center in the back is a sculpture by Russell Forrester. There's an abstract welded sculpture on the left by a man named Charles Ludke. Beautiful abstractions on the back wall. That's Sheldon Kirby. And they were a membership organization in those days. So things are very different. The institution is not called a museum at all. It's called the Art Center in La Jolla in those days. And you could belong, just like you could belong to the Artists Guild. And you could show there if you could demonstrate that you were good enough. And Jim was in a lot of shows there. This is the catalog from 1958 from their all-media membership show. And Jim has an interesting piece here. Oh yes, a piece called Tides, made of carved wood. And one of the things that I learned from spending some time with Jim and finding some unusual pieces of his work is that some of the things that he did in carved wood around this time or a couple of years later were made with native avocado wood. And so this piece is a carved wood sculpture that's just a couple of years later from 1961, and it came to me from a collector who lived there in La Jolla and got it at that time. It's dated 1961. It has all kinds of neat stuff going on. It's a piece of avocado that's left largely in its natural state, but chip carved and shaped and pieces of nails stuck into it and copper wrapped around the back of it and these trailing designs. And then it's painted with bright, almost Australian Aboriginal looking patterns. And it's something, so this is the reason I chose it, because that last piece in the catalog was called Tides, and you see the blue water painted on top of the block. So you can't see it in this image, but that block, the blue lines of the water are painted on top of the block. So the piece is coming up out of the water. And colorfully, cowrie shell, a lot of interesting stuff going on in that piece. It's from 1961. So also in La Jolla, there are all kinds of other things happening. Some galleries short-lived. These images come from a place called the William James Gallery that was right on La Jolla Boulevard. And there's a pot shown by one of the people that taught at the Art Center named Malcolm McLean, and that image with the vase. And then the other photo are early welded steel sculptures by James Hubbell being shown at the William James Gallery. I want you to keep your eye out, keep the one with the figure sitting on a rock, sort of keep that in mind. Also in La Jolla, there were exhibitions by Jim's brother, Bert Hubbell. So this was Jim's younger brother. He didn't spend much of his time, even at this point, in San Diego. He was living in Japan, where he still lives, but there were a couple of different times where his ceramic sculptures were exhibited. The text you see is from an exhibition up in Los Angeles, and the image on the right is one of Bert Hubbell's hand-molded clay sculptures. But there was also a show dedicated to Bert Hubbell's ceramics at a little bookstore which was next to the Art Museum in La Jolla, that a lot of you longtime San Diegans might remember as John Cole's bookshop. Well, before it was John Cole's, it was the Nexus Gallery, which was a super great bookstore that put on super cool art shows, and they showed Bert Hubbell's ceramic sculpture there at the Nexus. It's actually the guy who ran the Nexus that had that beautiful avocado wood piece. So now the next kind of institutional linchpin of these membership organizations, the Allied Craftsmen. So the San Diego Allied Craftsmen grow out of the immediate years after World War II. There's a big group of people called the Allied Artists Council that represent all different kinds of art forms. So there's dance, there's design, there's film, there's theater, there's writing, and they all get together and they have these terrific meetings, and they're very excited, and they do really cool stuff, and they do so much, and there's so much going on, they kind of implode after a couple of years. And the one group that continues going to this day out of that phenomenon is the Allied Craftsmen. They exist today, and Jim joined the Allied Craftsmen in about 1957. One of the first shows where I could find him exhibiting with the group took place at the museum in La Jolla, the Art Center in La Jolla. This is the flyer for that show. And at that time, Jim, in this roster of members, was the very newest member, the very last guy to join, number 37, right? So people came in and out of the group. The Allied Craftsmen were way tougher to get into than the Art Guild for the museum in Balboa Park. These guys were, it's a subjective, but it comes up over and over. At the time, these were the elite contemporary craftspeople in San Diego, right? They taught, most of them had extensive education backgrounds. They could do multiple media, they could make furniture, they could do screen printing, lots of really talented people. Half of them wrote articles about art and poetry and all kinds of stuff, people doing experimental stuff. It was a really dynamic group. Jim joins not long after he's back from his wartime service and his travels in Europe. Jim's in that group. Here's a photo from just a year or two later of that group installing their show at the La Jolla Museum of Art. This is their 1959 winter show, and you can see on the left, the lady with her arm on her hip there, that's Martha Longnecker. And the other guys, there's a guy with his hand on his head. That's a terrific painter named Gene Swiggett. Standing next to him, the tall guy, is the actor and enamelist Jackson Woolley. And then I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but the guy holding up the panel is an artist named Russell Baldwin. And what he's holding is one of those tall panels that went into the wishing well that we were talking about earlier. So Jim is working on, that's what Jim is putting out there to represent him in this group. And there's a little clipping that goes along with the review of that exact show, and it's talking about one of the newest people to join. The most versatile of these exhibitors appears to be James Hubbell, presenting ceramics, sculptures, and wood and wire, mosaics, leaded glass, etc. So those are the big membership organization that Jim joins within the first couple of years of him settling in San Diego. I mean, settling after not going off to school, not going off to war, etc. So a big show from 1959 that traveled all up and down the West Coast in 3 different states was this Third Pacific Coast Biennial. It was a product of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art that traveled, and Jim had a terrific cast bronze piece included in this traveling show that you can see in the image there. And this is one of the other pages from that catalog. I want you to see the kinds of shapes and the kinds of forms that people are working in to give you a little context for what, these are people from all up and down the coast. And there's work being done in carved wood. There's work being done in a modeling material called magnesite. And then there's more carved wood. And that piece I wanted to contrast or compare both with a piece of Jim's from around that time. And so, you look how this is someone removing material, removing mass from a timber, from a piece of lumber, a square, great, thick, 12 by 12, 10 by 10. And then Jim's doing the very same thing, removal of material from a salvaged piece of, and it's funny, they even start to look a little bit the same, some of the ways the head is articulated. So another show that took Jim's work further outside of San Diego was put on by the Long Beach Museum of Art, and it was a big traveling show. It traveled actually all over the nation, and they would have this series called Arts of Southern California, and it would focus on different materials. This show was from 1960 on ceramics, and it had a number of San Diego contributors. And you can see the kind of pottery being done. Here's a terrific lightweight bowl by the Natzlers, some Otto and Gertrude Natzler, some of the premier European settled in California and some of the best ceramists of that time period with the lava glaze, very distinctive there. And then at the end of the white page with like 2 sections, that's a piece done by a guy named Malcolm McLean who was working in La Jolla and teaching at the Art Center. It's slab built, essentially. It's not wheel thrown. And then on the right page are the 2 ceramics by Jim Hubbell. And you see how different, how his character, his eye, and what he decides to include in a great big ceramic traveling show is really, really unusual. There's one piece that he just calls a half circle. It's from 1958. And it looks like there's grapes or berries on it. And then there's another kind of somewhat minimal, very earthy column, but it has a cast bronze lid. Hey. Yeah, and so to give you, from that very same time period, 1958, here's another terrific piece of ceramic sculpture by Jim Hubbell. It's called, I love this because found the piece at one moment, found the tag and the black and white photo at another moment. So I never knew it had a proper title. I never knew exactly when the year was. And then later working with Laurel, we piece all these things together, and it's really fun. So it is unglazed. It's not glazed, but there's a lot of color and a lot of texture, and it's a terracotta material. And it's held up pretty well over all this time. It's from 1958, called Battlefield. So here's a couple of flyers from some other group shows taking place in different parts of San Diego. On the left is a show from the Jewish Community Center out on 54th Street. They had a really robust art program, and everybody participated. And this is from '62. James Hubbell, name misspelled, but he's exhibiting, again, these names start to become familiar. So there's Ella Marie and Jackson Woolley again. There's a terrific painter, surrealist painter named Phil Kirkland. Jack Hopkins, who eventually made massive pieces of furniture that created a big stir and were in those California design shows. And then on the right is an exhibition of painted sculpture, polychrome sculpture, from down at Southwestern College that was part of a really dynamic program run by a guy named Bob Matheny, who was constantly being fired and coming back to teach there, and was really a hero to his students and a wonderful guy. He only passed away a few years ago. And Jim is in that show, and his brother Bert Hubbell is in that show too. And then I wanted to single out just a couple of different specific one-person shows. So we've looked at group shows, we've looked at some shows that traveled outside of San Diego, and now here's a little taste of just Jim Hubbell in some of his very first exhibitions. And I'm doing it sort of out of sequence. He made these terrific invitations. That's what these are. They're only about, how big? That big. They're really cool. They open up. The pattern that you see there was something that Jim did with watercolor, and he did it on a couple of the paintings, or that idea comes up in a couple of the graphic works and paintings that are in the show. And it's a terrific little, preserved with its envelope, stained glass and sculpture by James Hubbell at the Art Center in La Jolla, and the opening reception February 26th, 1958. And here are some truly rare images of that show. So the show takes place in what they called at the time the one-person show gallery. So it's not their biggest gallery space, but it is the place they would turn over this space roughly every month. And it's loaded with great examples of Jim's work at that time. You can see hung against the window what looked to me like fairly heavier stained glass, and that's the way the invitation describes them. So it's not that working with the polyester resin. And there's a whole bunch of cast bronze and welded steel pieces. And there's that guy on the rock, up on top of a tall wooden pedestal. Here's another angle of the same exhibition space, and you can see they're including the watercolors, or I'm pretty sure they're watercolors, on the wall, and a lot of really cool, and you see the scale of the work. This is because also he's not doing the great large kinds of things that became possible when he gets a much larger studio out in Julian. This is all coming out of Rancho Santa Fe. This is coming out of his own foundry setup. I don't know how he even managed to build the furnace and cast that stuff. And this is done in 1958, and he only got back to San Diego after traveling in Europe in somewhere into 1957. So he put all this stuff together in like a compressed period in a really unusual circumstance that is not what everybody thinks about Jim Hubbell's output and working process. So the piece at the very back on the left, that's what it really looks like. That's a color example. So you can see the detail. The base, I think, was redone later, but very delicate, fragile rods, brass rods in there connecting these parts to a body that is cast in bronze from wax. More examples of building a model with wax are these pieces. And so I wanted to I'm trying to help show examples in color, where you get the surface, where you get the texture, where you get the color, and then to help you read the black and white photos. Another thing that's really interesting about this is that this is basically the same basic shape that is. You see the little balls connecting, and you see the arch connecting. And so he would cast something, make a model in wax, and cast it, and then find different ways to use that same piece, expanding on it in a different way in every iteration. So that's a close-up of one of those graphic works or watercolors in that show. There's a terrific review. It's a little hard for me to read it on this little screen with my bad eyesight, but it's really fascinating to me to read, a whole review of this writer. The writer's name was Armin Keatsman. He was the main writer for the San Diego Union at that time. It's not the Union Tribune. It's just the Union. There were two distinct newspapers. And this guy wrote constantly reviewing all the important shows. And he said some really interesting things here, including the fact that that guy who we saw standing off to the side of the art display, who's the director of the Art Center in La Jolla, his name was that apparently he said Hubbell's show was the best in the sequence of one-man shows at the Art Center. There was another early Hubbell show, 1957. This is literally his second one-person show. The one at the Art Center was technically his third. I'm working backwards. His third show. His second one-person show took place at the Athenaeum in La Jolla. And there's other interesting descriptions and sort of they're postulating. Oh, well, it's hard for me to read all this, so I'm not going to bore you with it. But it talks about his originality, his use of all these different kinds of materials. We feel he is on the threshold of discovery in the art world. The current exhibit depicts the James Hubbell of 1957. In 1960 and 1965, his technique and materials may be entirely different, but all signs indicate that they will always be interesting. And you can see the specific titles, you can see the materials. So he's showing some stained glass, he's showing some carved wood, he's showing some paintings and clay sculptures and so forth. And then, this is really the ground zero for, I think, Jim's career. It's a show he always mentions in his lists and his memories of his shows and their importance. The first one-person show that Jim ever had was at a place called the Capri Theater on Park Boulevard? Park Boulevard. And so you might remember it because it eventually became the Park Theater. But when it was remodeled after it was the Egyptian Theater, going way back, it was remodeled in 1954 by a new owner, and he took a very modernistic approach, and he was convinced by a local arts writer who became an architecture critic and was writing for some smaller papers at that time. His name was Jim Britton, and Jim Britton convinced the owner of the Capri Theater to allow him, Jim Britton, to curate shows and put them on in the foyer of this gallery. So you can see through the dark window in the black and white, you can see the paintings hanging on the wall in the background, and you can see them again there. There's actually a woolly enamel piece. And so there was a series of shows there. They were curated by Jim Britton. He was in the enviable position of being able to review the shows and write about them afterwards too, which is kind of a neat trick. But he had a lot of important artists show there, not only Jim. But this is what they did in that same space. So you look at the bottom of this, you see the black band, the like rubber down along the carpet, and then you can find the rubber running behind this too. For this installation, they created this whole, I'm not certain if it's wood or steel. It's probably steel because some of those pieces are pretty heavy. right, Laurel, with the the cement. So pretty heavy, so probably fabricated this whole thing out of steel and made it almost like a Mondrian grid, which is also kind of a theme of the exterior of the Capri, a kind of a grid, a 1940s modernist grid, and filled it with all kinds of really terrific James Hubbell pieces, showing again a kind of a fairly small scale. There are pieces where it's plaster or cement, and there are great crude chunks of glass embedded into that and then framed. There are very lightweight welded steel pieces. And in the center, there is one of his resin panels that's super colorful. And so, Keith, forgive me, in order for people to kind of get what that might have looked like in color, I'm going to show a window from Keith's home, which was done by Jim Hubbell. But you see the patterns. These are stones. There's glass. The long, tall pieces are little tiny pieces of wood. And it's the most terrific color that you get, especially through natural light, through this kind of material. It's unlike stained glass. It's really different, a different animal. And it's really, Jim, but you can see these kind of swirling overall mosaic type patterns, the same kinds of organic shapes that you see later in his work, but that's also what you're seeing in the center of this. And what this was a shower enclosure, a door. So completely usable, completely designed with intent to be touched and used and lived with, which is, yeah, Jim. So these are some close-ups in color of the pieces in that big display. I kind of went overboard, I broke it down, and so here's the piece in color that you can see on the top shelf there, and next to it on the top shelf is that stained glass, leaded glass panel on the right. With some of these pieces, Jim would work in a fairly traditional manner. There's leading, there's pieces of glass, but he also often would paint on top of the glass and create sort of extra dimension and extra space. And so, seeing the colors involved. Here's another piece that's hanging in that display. Imagining all that color, I hope makes you read that black and white image a little differently. There's two pieces that I'm going to show you. So the sort of obelisk piece standing there, and then the piece up higher on the left are these in real life or in color. It's a metal frame, a black iron steel frame with some glass and some brass worked onto it. And then on the right is some polyester resin. It's the kind of thing, it reminds you of a bug stuck in amber a little bit. I mean, this is one of the things that artists working in that material had to be worried about, is that there was a very cliche kind of approach to working with that sort of stuff. So you had to be careful to come up with something that didn't remind people of a bug stuck in amber. And then this is the review that James Hubbell wrote about that show. There's a lot of wonderful tidbits in here. And again, he talks about the variety of material, and he talks about Jim's character and how he doesn't want to settle into one thing or another thing, and he reserves the right to be inconsistent and all this kind of stuff. But also, he kind of ends this with a really interesting passage that I'm just going to read in closing. Naked in clothing. That tells you something. All right. Practically considered, the most useful item in the Capri show is a plastic and glass bathtub enclosure. It's actually a shower, not a bathtub. Many of the pieces hint of architectural use, as in modern church design. The apparition of colored glass and plastic dazzling in the light has attracted unusual attention among Capri patrons. This is decidedly a medium through which to win converts to, in quotes, modern art. However, while we were putting up the show, one elderly citizeness tottered in, tittered at our efforts, and without looking at the display, delivered herself of a short critique of modern art, ending with the daring phrase, "It stinks." The recoil force of her explosive delivery almost knocked her to the floor, but she regained enough equilibrium to teeter back outdoors into the unstudied but familiar and therefore comforting ugliness, which is the average city street. So I'm very sorry that takes so long, and I went on and on. And if people have questions, I guess now is the time. Yes, you in the back.
Hi, can you tell us, is the Wishing Well Hotel and or Jim's mother's home, are they still around? Do they still exist?
Well, so Keith wants to answer, and he knows. And well, you just gave me a big sign there. What am I supposed to say? Go ahead, Keith.
So I went to a woman's home in, I'm trying to figure out the neighborhood, Ilan-Lael. And she swears that when she bought the house many years ago, the real estate agent said, this was a hotel nearby, and it is now here at the front door. I said, that sounds like a weird story, only knowing of this wishing well. So as I toured the house in my work to understand Bruce Richard's architecture, it basically came to me that the lobby structure of the Wishing Well Hotel, not the restaurant, which is those wonderful pictures, but the lobby was dismantled and moved 4 miles from the original site.
But the answer...
There's no validation. It's a complete attribution by this owner. But it's all painted, and it looks nothing like those pictures, but it is a structure, and she said it was the hotel.
The simplest answer is the hotel was torn apart. And then the other answer about Julia Larrea's home in Rancho Santa Fe is I have no idea.
I know where it is, and there's a different house on its site, but I don't know the story. It's demolition or relocation. I'll be quiet.
Marianne?
Yes.
No, Keith, they're fine.
So the story of James that you're telling us is his deep involvement with the exhibition community in the early part of his career in San Diego. Does that, I mean, my understanding is that eventually goes away as he moves on to other things. Do you agree with that? And when would you say that happened?
Well, so you, for whatever reason, you make me think of a lot of different things. So one of the things that's become so interesting to me about this little time period is that he was an artist working on his own, producing all his own stuff with his own hands, and beginning to exhibit and join in community. And so then, I don't remember the exact year, but operations gradually move. In 1958, he and Anne buy the property in Julian, and they begin building their first house, which is really, that very first buildings are really different from what they did later, right? It's closer to a Bruce Richards sort of wood modern structure with adobe and all that kind of thing. And so everything is taking time, and as I understand it, they don't really inhabit the site until something like 61 or 62. And so, to me, the changes occur once he established, and then I don't know how long it takes to build the big studio out there. 1968. So, through all that time, I'd say, of the 60s, 50s and the beginning of the 60s, Jim is exhibiting a fair bit. But then at some point the first assistant comes.
Right.
So
He becomes a teacher, a mentor, and other people are doing his work because he can't do it all.
so there's a year
There's a
there
family to
too.
care for.
There's a year there too, where the first I forget if they called it assistant or like a fellow or something, but I read in one of the books, I read about a specific year where the very first guy came to work with Jim out in Julian, right?
Right.
So that's a big change. And now, and I think at that point also, okay, now, the Wishing Well Hotel, and Keith is going to talk all about this, but that hotel was in many ways a manifestation of a thesis of these two guys of what could be done, right? The integration of art and architecture in a big way. I mean, all those panels and all those doors and, metal sculptures on the wall. So they were really putting out this idea of what they could give people. And that idea begins to ramp up as more projects come in to Bruce Richards and other architects. Interestingly, by 1962, Jim is doing some pretty major commissions for entirely different architects. And this is only 62, this is 1 year after Wishing Well. So he does a great big metal sculpture that goes up on the facade of a building which was at the time, now it's Point Loma Nazarene, right? Now it was Cal Western, and there's a great big building that had a sort of a blank expanse, and in 1962, Jim gets commissioned to do a huge metal mural attached to the front of that building. The same year also, he does a great big hanging chandelier for the biggest movie theater in San Diego, which was the brand new Cinema 21 in Mission Valley, which had a great round lobby, and the building existed for a while. It was one of those big round buildings. And there's a huge hanging chandelier of all kinds of, so I think what happens is there's a lot more architectural work coming along fast, and he gets someone to come and help him. And by 1968, he's got a whole big studio and more people come to help him. And so I'm pretty sure that he begins to focus more and more on the architectural commissions.
He has a
And-
family too. He's married with children
Yeah,
at this time now, so there's a family to care for,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
I mean, but that's also what makes this period of 56 or so to 62 such a fascinating period to try and excavate, because it's a whole different picture of Jim Hubbell than what most of us are carrying around in our minds. I mean, interestingly too, and there's lots of more little factoids that bear investigation, but we've had a conversation, Laurel and Keith and myself, about, as it seems to me at the moment, Jim is introduced to Bruce Richards through a friend of his mother's who's having a house built in Del Mar by Bruce Richards. Of course, his mom runs this shop in Del Mar and knows people around Del Mar, and she's right in the middle of the community. So the friend of his mom, Jim's mom, asks Jim to make a smallish stained glass window for her house. It's not for Bruce Richards, it's for the friend of his mom. But Jim provides a small window to this woman, and in that interaction meets Bruce for the very first time. And that may have been, I don't know what the year was of that first meeting, but that's the way it reads to me, is that's the first time they ever see each other, meet each other, is because of a friend of the mom's in the small window. Then they meet, but then Jim goes off. He goes off to, Cranbrook. He goes off to 7 months hitchhiking and living in Europe. So he's not back for like 2 years. And then one of the first things, so anyways, it's hard, it's still, there's more excavation work that needs to be done, but I get the feeling that Jim's actually working with Bruce Richards doesn't even start to happen until 1958, which is one date that's provided in the Oceanside chronology. But that Jim must have told someone, I started working with Bruce in 1958. I don't know that that's true. No?
No, I'm reaffirming what you're saying.
Oh.
You're on point.
So
You're on point.
So the thing is they know each other. They know each other, but they're not working together for a while. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that all this work that Jim is putting out that suggests architectural application is not because he's working with Bruce Richards. It's just because he's Jim, and he's been to Cranbrook, and he's been all over Europe, and he's looking at churches, and he's looking at stained glass windows, and he's got a bunch of other artist friends, and there's a big trend all over the nation for artists and craftsmen in the 50s and 60s to start doing things that work with houses. And so this is, again, one of the important kind of affirmations for me of doing this research is that Jim is the first sort of modern artist that I know of to start doing that kind of work. I mean, there are muralists that did paintings, in the 30s, and there are other people, but to work with sculpturally, to work with organic form, and to work with the kinds of stuff he picks up at Cranbrook, Academy of Art, where, for anyone that doesn't know, there's a litany of incredible designers and heavyweight 20th century design and craft and manufacturing influencers that eventually went through that program at Cranbrook where Jim went. So he brought a lot back to San Diego when he settled here. And he had already picked up on an awful lot. There's other stuff that I could have included in these. I was so worried that it was going to go on and on. There was the biggest nationwide barometer of this kind of modern approach to craft and modern approach to design was at that time in New York City called the Museum of Contemporary Craft. And they would have lots and lots of really big, really well-done shows. One of their shows in 1957, just as Jim is starting to step forth, is a show called The Patron Church. And it's all about modern-minded artists providing work for churches, modern approach to stained glass, modern approach to liturgical instruments, modern approach to the hi, Rev. Yeah, that's sorry. Apologies. Yes.
Question back here. Just to understand his influences and his terracotta works, are you familiar on what areas of the country he hitchhiked during the times that he hitchhiked this country?
I didn't exactly get the whole idea. I'm going to come right over to you so I make sure I hear it. Ask again.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand his influences and his
Oh.
terracotta art that
Yes.
he did, and that you mentioned that his influences were from his hitchhiking or his working and his travels to hitchhike to Europe. Are you familiar in what areas he hitchhiked in the United States or Europe or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's so the question is, where do some of his influences come from? In particular, maybe with the clay or the terracotta work. And the answer is, oh my God, you got to read this little book because he was all over. I mean, he's in a military academy for a year before even high school, so that he can be around horses. One of those hitchhiking trips in the middle of high school is to go off to Wyoming to spend a few months working as a ranch hand to be around horses. This book, I think, will help provide more, but also he's been all over by the time he starts doing this stuff in 1956. He's been through Africa, he's been to France, Spain, Italy, England, and all the while he's been sketching. And even on his hitchhiking trips in America, he's carrying his sketch pad. And then in Korea, when he's drafted and has to go off to war, not because he wants to, he's drafted into the army. He carries his sketchbooks, he gets opportunities to do sign painting and things like that, even on the boat, on the ship that he's going across the ocean, and then while he's there, he gets opportunities to paint programs and signs on the bases, and then when he gets his free time and gets sent to Japan for a while, he carries his sketchbook around, and so he's, it's a phenomenal amount that he's absorbed at such a young age. And it's, again, another reason why, and the idea of this kind of also the time that Kerouac wrote this book about adventuring back and forth about the country that was super influential, that there's something about that time that he was living in that also allowed a lot of these accidents to happen. He would meet people that way. You know, there's a great story about he's in New York and he wants to go out to see a museum exhibition and he doesn't have a winter coat. He's just there to visit his sister. And so he goes out and knocks on the neighbor's door, and the guy he meets becomes a lifelong friend that allows him to travel to Africa and stay with him in England and visit Europe, and is also interested in arts and cultures and these things that, so these kind of coincidences or twists of fate in Jim's life, because he's also so open to this, he's also so unusually receptive and unusually sensitive. Oh, come on, is that it? Not one more question? All right. Dismissed. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you, Dave.
I have lots of questions, Dave.
Yeah.
I'm bored.
Me too. Thanks for coming.
And to see him and know him now.
Yes. Yes, exactly.